Welcome to the Policy Insights Forum and our Strategic Perspectives series. Wars. Special guest is UK author and retired Brigadier Ben Barry, a senior fellow with the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. And our event moderator is Dr. Paul Taillon, Vice Chair of the Policy Insights Forum. I'm Goran Samuel Pesic, Chair of the Policy Insights Forum and President and CEO of Samuel Associates. The Policy Insights Forum is a nonpartisan research division of Samuel Associates. The forum helps improve policy and decision-making through research, analysis, and engagement. Samuel Associates is a trusted advisor to many influential businesses and organizations. The firm advises leaders on strategy, lobbying, and marketing across numerous industries and levels of government in Canada and abroad. Today's event will explore the following topics: Allied strategy in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Canadian contribution, lessons for future politicians, bureaucrats, and war fighters. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge Canadian, American, UK, and foreign government representatives participating in today's event. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the forum. Dr. Paul Taillon, I invite you to take the floor as the event moderator.
Thank you, Goran. This morning, we are most fortunate to have as our guest speaker, Brigadier Ben Barry. He's the author of a number of positively reviewed studies, and his latest book, Blood, Metal, and 2001 to 2014, in military history, has been heralded as one of the finest one-volume histories of these long campaigns. His book follows a chronological format, easily taking the reader through major phases of operations. Unlike many recent histories, particularly the Afghan, NATO's role during the difficult years of 2005 to 2009. That period, a time when the United States had changed focus in the Afghan arena, there were increasingly difficult operational challenges that evolved in the wake of the Iraq invasion of 2003. Interestingly, Brigadier Barry dedicates numerous pages to Canada's combat commitment and describes a 2006 Canadian-led Operation Medusa, which is reportedly the largest ground operation undertaken by NATO to date. Furthermore, an overview of Canada's commitment to Kandahar province during our Afghan operations. Brigadier Barry sees both conflicts described in military parlance as economy of force operations. Cities in fighting at a distance, emphasizing the lack of containing complex social, cultural, and tribal environments that dominated each nation and were, for the most part, all but alien to the forces committed. On a personal level, I found this book to be one of the best and most engaging reads of the year, with substantive lessons that should be taken on board to further understand the complexities of modern war and to inform and educate politicians, bureaucrats, and military professionals, as well as the layman, as to the heavy costs and complexities of contemporary warfighting. We are delighted to have this morning Brigadier Ben Barry for his presentation, UK Reflections on the Afghan and Iraq War. Brigadier Barry, the floor is yours, sir.
I owe Canada a lot. My father was a UK exchange officer at Kingston in the mid-1960s, the best posting my family ever had. I've made great use of the prairie at Suffield for armoured warfare training. In 2003, I commanded the NATO multinational brigade in Banja Luka. 1/3 of the brigade was from Canada, including many key staff in the headquarters, but also 2nd PPCLI and D Squadron of the Lord Strathconas, as well as a Griffon helicopter squadron, All excellent units, and the British had much to learn from them. And General Hillier took an encouraging interest in the brigade and its activities. War's a terrible thing. I had walk-on parts in the wars in Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan, showing me the cost in blood, treasure, and to families attending too many military funerals. I'm sure those of you in the audience who've got well-earned campaign medals would agree the value of learning painful lessons by taking them on the chin. So you'll forgive me if I'm sometimes outspoken. These two wars are pregnant with lessons for today. For example, there's currently considerable debate in the UK about the future relevance of tanks and armoured vehicles. I assess that they had very high utility in Iraq, where the British and American armoured divisions were decisive in the regime change. And heavily protected armoured vehicles also had decisive effect in stabilisation operations and the high proportion of fighting that took place in urban areas, including in Baghdad, Basra, Fallujah, and Sadr City. I've sought to explain how the wars took the contours that they did, including battles that deserve wider understanding. It gives me no pleasure to judge that if any actor won the Iraq War, it was Tehran, achieving more of its strategic aims than Washington or London. Of all the generals who led troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, I judge Iran's General Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Quds Force, as the most successful. And on current trajectories in Afghanistan, I think the Taliban are more likely to succeed than the Kabul government, the US or NATO. Why was this? Well, we have to be frank. I saw inadequate strategic leadership by national leaders and their governments, defence ministries and forces chiefs. Contributory factors included weakness in intelligence and understanding, reconstruction efforts, political strategies, military strategy, operational concepts, tactics and equipment, providing plenty of opportunities that were exploited by insurgents, warlords, organised crime and militias. And in both wars, there was much overlap between these type of actors and local and national politicians. I start the story by explaining the experience of US and UK forces in the quarter century before 9/11, including deliberate neglect of counterinsurgency. I also wonder if their success in Bosnia and Kosovo had created a warm glow of complacency. The campaign that the US rapidly improvised in Afghanistan, combining the CIA, special forces, precision bombing and Northern Alliance militias, was highly successful. And the long-range insertion of US Marines from the Indian Ocean to Kandahar was the most ambitious amphibious operation of recent times. Also successful was the deployment of a British-led multinational force to ISAF to Kabul, as well as the Canadian battle group to Kandahar. Although the subsequent US attacks at Tora Bora and Operation Anaconda, which of course was joined by that Canadian battle group from Kandahar, were problematic. Both operations have hard lessons about planning, about air-land coordination, about coordination between conventional and special forces. It's easy, of course, to be wise after the event, but I do wonder if deployment of a capable combined joint task force headquarters to Afghanistan meant that would have meant that synchronization would have been improved and fewer opportunities missed. The international effort in Afghanistan initially had wide international support, but the Iraq War diverted much military intelligence development and diplomatic capability from Afghanistan to Iraq, which imposed fatal opportunity costs on the international project in Afghanistan. Now, of course, regime change in Iraq had been thoroughly planned and drew upon well-trained and well-led modern air-land forces to defeat poorly trained and much less modern Iraqi forces. There are battles to learn from, including the innovative CIA and special forces operations in Kurdistan that incorporated a parachute brigade and air-landed armour. Also, the US Armoured Brigade Thunder runs that collapsed the Iraqi defence of Baghdad, and the British attack on Basra, a smart siege, all those operations capturing the cities without flattening them. Post-conflict stabilisation of Iraq descended into chaos as a result of decisions made and not made by President Bush, Secretary Rumsfeld, and Ambassador Bremer. And Prime Minister Blair didn't do any better either. This was also inflamed by the disgraceful abuse of prisoners by US and British troops. These problems fatally damaged the legitimacy of the Iraq War, both in Iraq and internationally. And this also cross-contaminated the international legitimacy of the war in Afghanistan. In Iraq, it took several years for the US to recognize that the ends, ways, and means being employed were inadequate. Adaptations were eventually made, including the 2007 US surge. These created limited political progress. Progress which, of course, was subsequently reversed by Prime Minister Maliki, who acted as the midwife of ISIS. My book's also got a chapter on how Britain came within inches of strategic defeat in Basra, something that dented their military credibility and confidence, damage that still lingers on. My story then switches to Afghanistan. I begin by looking at how the British got bogged down in Helmand province. I then have a case study of Operation Medusa, the 2006 Canadian-led brigade attack in Panjwai. This battle gets 7 pages in the book, which is actually about twice as much as all the other battles get. Why is this? Firstly, British General David Richards, then COM-ISAF, emphasised the importance of NATO's first ever brigade attack, as did many of my chums who were in Afghanistan with the British Army at the time. And secondly, Brigadier Fraser's book on the operation was crammed with both incident and insight. I observe when I look at the battle that the British contributed little to it, and that their national command and control arrangements were over-complex, suboptimal, and didn't do anything to promote cooperation, making life unnecessarily difficult for Brigadier Fraser and the US Major General Frickley above him. I'd of course be interested to know if those of you who've read the book think I've drawn the right conclusions about that decisive battle. Just as interesting to me was your Army's rapid fielding of Leopard 2 tanks, really excellent tanks, by the way. This is one of the main examples I use in a chapter called Learning Under Fire, about military adaptation and what the inhibitors are to this and the success factors are. I conclude that the key success factor is for senior leaders to actively encourage and lead adaptation, as demonstrated by the greater success that Secretary of Defense Robert Gates achieved in this role than did Donald Rumsfeld. I also cover the nearly victorious Taliban attacks on the small British bases in Helmand in 2006 and 7, and on the isolated US bases that were subject to similar attacks in eastern Afghanistan in 2008 and 2009. These were desperate sieges, the defenders only surviving through being able to shoot straighter than the Taliban, but also through extensive airstrikes. Great bravery and determination was displayed by the US and British defenders and by the attacking Taliban fighters, reminding us of the enduring role of morale, fighting spirit, and small unit combat leadership. I also assess President Obama's Afghan surge and the problematic transfer of the war to Afghan leadership. And the subsequent weakness of the Afghan government and its forces is demonstrated by the 2015 capture by the Taliban of Kunduz, although they were eventually thrown out, and the considerable weakening of the government position in Helmand over recent years. Moving on to some general points about the hard lessons of the war. Force had wide utility for the regime change campaigns, for counterinsurgency, and of course for the bad guys, for the militias and insurgents fighting to further their political aims and those of their external sponsors such as Iran and Pakistan. The ferocity of the armed opposition in Iraq from 2004 and Afghanistan from 2006 was a strategic shock to the US, but more so to many of its allies. Against opponents determined to fight, international forces who couldn't fight or whose governments wouldn't let them fight were of little utility. They added friction. This reminds us that combat is the core military capability and that armed forces should be benchmarked against determined and capable enemies. The wars, of course, confirmed the inherent unpredictability of war, where the enemy has a vote and may fight to the death to cast it. They show that war is a clash of wills between actors seeking to shape events to suit their political aims, seeking to gain and exploit all the advantages they can. And in the wars, you can find examples of attrition, of maneuver, of symmetric and asymmetric military approaches. There were action-reaction dynamics on all sides, where many improvements in tactics and capability were checked by a counter-improvement by the other side. And the battle against roadside bombs in both wars is an example of this. Both the short regime change campaigns can be seen as linear conflicts. Subsequent post-conflict stabilization campaigns were increasingly complex non-linear campaigns with many variable factors which interacted with each other in constantly changing ways. And this was in part a result of the nature of the enemy. For example, in Iraq, there was considerable overlap between militias, organized crime, political and religious extremists and death squads, and crime and extortion often funded insurgent activity. It was the foundation of insurgent logistics in a way. On top of this, military operations were overlaid with complex, multiple political, religious, ethnic, and economic conflicts. The strategic, operational, and tactical levels often overlapped. A high degree of complexity endured through both wars and was felt at every level of command. And General Petraeus told US Congress that war is not a linear phenomenon, it's a calculus, not arithmetic. Or as his British deputy, Lieutenant General Graham Lamb, put it, this is as complex as anything I've ever done. This is three-dimensional chess in a dark room. Military operations were largely amongst the people in the urban areas of both countries and in the densely populated breadbaskets of southern Afghanistan. Combat increasingly occurred where people live. This has implications for the future because along with the global mega trend of urbanization, it means that urban operations will increasingly become the new normal. And I think that armed forces that are not competent in urban environments should increasingly be seen as incompetent. The stabilization operations were contests for the minds of the people, the populations, the insurgents, the militias, and their military and political leadership. This interpenetration and interdependence of war and politics was amplified throughout 21st century communications, which accelerated the passage of information of various degrees of truth, rumor, or lies, the battle of the narrative. There was a political dimension to military operations, often right down to the tactical level. And in my book, I have several vignettes, examples of armed politics that illustrate this, including the role of two US civilians, Carter Markasian in Helmand and Douglas Grindle in Kandahar. The established principles of insurgency and counterinsurgency applied, including the primacy of politics, addressing or exploiting the root causes of the insurgency, and making progress across all areas of government and development. The wars show the importance of achieving legitimacy and operating in accordance with the law. International forces often struggle to achieve this, and this was all exacerbated by inadequate understanding, poor intelligence, abuse of detainees, and initially by counterproductive tactics. All this shows us that wars are multidisciplinary activity. It requires integration of all activities at all levels, beyond combined arms, beyond joint, and beyond interagency. And this, of course, applied not only to military tactics in rural and urban terrain, it also applied to the considerable improvements in integrating air and land forces and integrating special and conventional forces, as well as exploiting all types of intelligence from tactical to strategic, but also to fully integrating all levers of national power, military, intelligence, diplomatic, and development. And I'm afraid that it seemed to me in Afghanistan, the Taliban often achieved a greater unity of effort than the Afghan government, the US, or NATO. And that still seems to apply to the talks that are going on in Doha right now. And I also came to the conclusion that Iran was better at this in Iraq than the UK or US. The Iranian Republican Guards, Quds Force, combines irregular warfare, special forces, setting up clandestine networks, capacity building, forming and leading proxy forces from insurgent cells to the conventional armed force that is Lebanese Hezbollah. It also does propaganda and buys influence with a combination of cash and threats. It also has a seat on Tehran's National Security Council and sets Iran's policy for Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, often providing the Iranian ambassadors to those countries. To use Western terminology, it's a standing interagency task force from which the US and its allies have much to learn. So for those of you who are grappling with the challenges of understanding and conducting current and future wars, I hope the book's analysis of armed politics, the battle of the narrative, linear and non-linear war, and military adaptation and learning under fire might help. And there's a summary chapter at the end. But an alternative and more interesting way might be to take the writings of Clausewitz and lay on top of them the books of Hobbes, of Machiavelli, and Sir Rupert Smith, and then box sets of the TV series House of Cards and Game of Thrones, and then flush them into an industrial shredder and see what comes out. But it will probably be cheaper and less time consuming to look at my book. There's a lot I've not covered, for example, intelligence, urban warfare, deception, the roles of helicopters, something that saw both failures and successes, military command and control, naval aspects, logistics, and working with indigenous forces in both wars. So I'd probably upset a proportion of the audience, but I'd now be very happy to take questions or observations on any aspects of both wars. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Brigadier. That was an extremely interesting and comprehensive overview of your study. We have a first question here. It starts off with a bit of an intro. In the wake of the invasion of Afghanistan, the US and its allies quickly planned to develop the country from a middle-aged state to one embracing democracy, rule of law, human rights, while mitigating the narcotic trafficking. Did the US and NATO, politicians and military planners fully appreciate the complexity of the task at hand, and what lessons can we derive from this experience?
Well, I think most of those who were involved in that initial planning in 2002 would probably conclude that they didn't. And there are a number of examples which have been well recorded by the development community of aid being foisted on Afghanistan that turned out to be inappropriate. And sometimes the Afghan government of President Karzai, against its will, choosing to use Western models. For example, Italy tied aid to legislation that President Karzai advised was inappropriate, and it turned out to be so. I think, though, the biggest single problem with the international project in Afghanistan was the massive opportunity cost of the US and the UK switching their attention to Iraq, which sucked away government, defense, intelligence bandwidth. And as the Iraq project went wrong, it also sucked away money and people for development. But I think there is an observation here. When I did my study of the Iraq War for the British Army, many of the more reflective British officers I interviewed said that too often when we considered a problem, we looked at it from our point of view and only added on the Iraqi viewpoint as an afterthought. In retrospect, we should have started with the Iraqi viewpoint.
You argue in your book that between 2006 and 2009, the military forces involved in Afghanistan came close to the brink of strategic failure. You alluded to this in your preface. How did this come about and why?
I think a combination of over-optimism. Over-optimism, I think, was often displayed in London and Washington, DC, and insufficient understanding. What I think had also happened was between 2003 and 2006, the US and its allies in Afghanistan had created the opportunities for the Taliban insurgency. Much of this was due to aligning with or empowering warlords or other actors that were predatory on the Afghan civilian population. I'm not a judge of the difficulties after Operation Medusa that Canada encountered in Kandahar province, but I can tell you that many of my British contemporaries and much of the feeling in the Ministry of Defence between 2006 and 2009 was that the UK wasn't doing enough, And unless the US could be persuaded to decisively intervene in southern Afghanistan, they were on the track to strategic defeat.
In your discussion, you noted that the conduct of war is different from other human activities. Wars are eminently unpredictable, and no matter how well one side plans, the other is doing everything it can to negate their opponent's operations. What does our long Western engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq tell us about contemporary warfare?
Well, I think, first of all, it reminds us that war is a dangerous sport. It's an outdoor sport, and it's a contact sport. And, that combat is the core capability. And there are a number of European NATO armies who, when this problem was presented to them with force, for example, in the Shia uprising in Iraq in 2004, and in Afghanistan after 2006, they found it very difficult to make a positive contribution to the US-led or NATO campaigns, and their reputation and credibility was damaged with the US and other members of NATO. Well, that certainly wasn't the case with either the UK or Canada. I think there are many lessons, I think, of Iraq and Afghanistan that do carry over to contemporary and near future conflict. There are obviously some that don't, but I think above all, it's, as Clausewitz recommends, you understand the character of the war that you're in, and you must attempt to fight the war you're in rather than the war you wish it to be in. So often with the US, it seemed as if Donald Rumsfeld wanted to fight the war he wished to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan rather than the war that was going on. And I think for the military, it shows you just how important it is to get command and control right and to develop a thorough understanding of what's going on.
In 2011 and 2012, the United States and the United Kingdom surged substantial forces at great cost in material and manpower into Afghanistan. Why was this not effective?
Well, it was effective in the short term in terms of pushing the Taliban out of key rural terrain and pushing them further away from key urban terrain like Kandahar and Kabul. But I think in President Obama's decision to surge, if you look at the overall decision making, which is exhaustively recorded in a number of US memoirs and accounts, there was over-optimism about the political health of the Karzai government, the state of development of the Afghan government, Afghan institutions, and the Afghan military. I think also that the US was in a bind because they were never really able to pressure Pakistan enough to coerce the Taliban to reduce their activity in Afghanistan.
It is acknowledged that Secretary Rumsfeld and President Bush were politically averse to partaking in nation building in the wake of invading both Afghanistan and Iraq. Could you comment on why this was so? And was there any follow-up or alternate plan?
Well, I think President Bush and Rumsfeld made this very clear in speeches. For example, Bush made it very clear in the election campaign. And Rumsfeld was rather pleased to tell everybody that what the US was going to do in Afghanistan wasn't going to be nation building. Well, the rationale for this that they explained in their speeches was that they saw the US Army as the wrong instrument for nation building, and that prolonged commitments to nation building, including in Haiti, in Bosnia and Kosovo, they felt had reduced the readiness of the US Army for its priority task, which they saw as state versus state warfare. I mean, don't forget that the Korean Peninsula was still considered a military threat by Washington, D.C. during that period. And, they wanted the Europeans and they wanted the United Nations to take the burden of nation building. Well, what's quite interesting is that many US Army senior officers actually had seen the need for nation building, and they'd seen the value of the international community's nation building efforts after the conflicts in Bosnia and Kosovo. quite early after the regime change in Iraq, I think there was a wake-up call to the members of the US National Security Council, and their hope was that they could bring in the United Nations into Iraq rather than like they brought them into Kosovo. But the terrorist bombing of the UN headquarters made that much more difficult. They'd also underestimated how much Saddam Hussein had blamed the United Nations for the privations of Iraq under the sanctions regime, and that within Iraq the UN didn't have the respect that it say had in Kosovo. But I think, overall, the US government was being over optimistic about what was happening in Iraq, and the very difficult the failure of the Baghdad operations in 2006, plus the bombing of the Golden Mosque at Samarra, which really set up a civil war within Iraq. That was a strategic shock to President Bush, and credit to him developing sources of advice from outside the Pentagon, the Beltway, and the members of the US National Security Council. He took the very brave decision to go for the surge and support it, and that at least turned the security situation around for a while.
Brigadier, in your book, you basically focused a lot, or at least on a number of areas, particularly the issue of strategic education and development. What do these wars tell us about the necessity of educating and developing political and military strategic leadership during peacetime?
Well, I'll start with the easy bit, which is the military. In my view, as people climb the command ladder and go through their military service, they need professional military education, which broadens and deepens their understanding of war, conflict and security, and also probably broadens and deepens their leadership styles. I mean, I found myself that working with NGOs and local government in Bosnia required quite a different leadership style from that of commanding a battalion or brigade attack. And there's no doubt in my mind that the US military and the UK military had both disadvantaged themselves by largely removing counterinsurgency from the syllabuses of their staff colleges. I think, though, there is a question about how you educate civilian leaders across government and how you educate actual elected officials of government. I think they have to learn about the higher management of crises and conflicts. For example, between 2003 and 2009, the British didn't have a functioning National Security Council, and nor did the Prime Minister really have a war cabinet. Both of these have been proven mechanisms for running military conflicts, and it wasn't until 2010 that the British set up a proper National Security Council. How you compel elected officials to actually spend time on personal development, I'm not quite sure, but I think there's great virtue in governments having high-level crisis exercises where politicians play themselves. That was a feature of British government during the Cold War, and Mrs. Thatcher used to relish playing herself on NATO exercises. I think that's the only way you actually develop the muscle memory in politicians about decision making under crisis. They do quite a bit anyway, but defense and security crises have a dimension all of their own. I would hope that in the near future, enough governments have been making crisis decisions and been forced into serious interagency integration as a result of the pandemic, that there'll be a bit of a bow wave in this area.
A follow-on question, reflecting upon the political and military leadership exhibited throughout these extended conflicts, a number of leaders were seen to be more effective than others. Drawing from your research, are there any notable military and or political leaders who stood out, and if so, why?
Well, I would say I think the most successful general was General Soleimani. Of course, he had plenty of US and UK mistakes in Iraq to exploit, but he also had this very capable tool of Quds Force, a standing interagency task force. On the US side, well, clearly General Petraeus deserves the reputation he carries as much for being the insurgent at the heart of the US rediscovery of coin as anything else. I think General Mattis has a well-deserved reputation from his time commanding the 1st Marine Division, helping Petraeus with counterinsurgency, and then as a very successful commander CENTCOM towards the end of both wars, one who quite clearly was prepared to speak truth to power. And I think actually speaking truth to power, that's a really key theme. There were some, at times, I don't think truth was spoken to power, or the military command and control system rather diluted the truth that could have been spoken to power. In the exhaustive British inquiry into its role in the Iraq War, there's an interesting section called Optimism Bias, where the inquiry traced about half a dozen examples of the British Defence Secretary giving hugely over-optimistic briefings to Cabinet. Other great generals, well, I think British General McCall, who set up ISAF initially in 2001 and acted as a military advisor to President Karzai, was very successful. And I also think the two colonels who successfully stabilized Iraqi cities, then Colonel H.R. McMaster and Colonel Sean McFarland in Tal Afar and Ramadi, were also extremely successful. Not to mention, of course, Brigadier Fraser with that very, very difficult task.
We're going to keep number 2.
Doing Operation Medusa.
The American invasion of Afghanistan has been described as a brilliant and audacious military operation that successfully removed the Taliban government from Afghanistan. Planned and orchestrated by the CIA in conjunction with U.S. Special Operations Forces, utilizing anti-Taliban warlords and intimately assisted by American air power, this operational synergy was brilliantly successful. In the immediate wake and success of that light touch invasion, some strategists argue that this is a unique military operation. Others suggested that a new and improved RMA, Revolution in Military Affairs, had evolved. Was this situation and success unique, or one of, or a portent of the future?
That's a really interesting question. We should remember that the US had no contingency plans for war in Afghanistan, nor for that matter did the British or NATO. And that the 4th phase of the plan was to have been a conventional invasion that many thought would come at about the 6-month point. Indeed, I was involved in a certain amount of limited British planning about deploying a brigade by rail to Uzbekistan to take part in a war in Afghanistan. More feasible than it sounds, actually. Well, the US, of course, took advantage of winning tools they had in their toolbox. You know, the Green Berets of the Special Forces Group, the US Air Force combat controllers with their laser designators, the CIA with satellite phones and suitcases full of money, and they made them work brilliantly. I think, though, that in itself engendered overconfidence, and the way the model was applied to the Battle of Tora Bora, which by all accounts allowed bin Laden and his entourage to escape, and the way command and control struggled in Operation Anaconda showed the limitations of the model as applied to Afghanistan. But the CIA did a similar operation with about a year's lead-up time in Kurdistan in 2002, 2003. And the commander of Erbil Station has actually written an interesting book on this, The CIA War in Afghanistan. And they were able to insert a special forces group reinforced by an airborne brigade and with an airline-landed armoured battle group into Kurdistan, which helped pin the Iraqi forces on the Green Line, preventing a couple of corps from reinforcing central Iraq. Quite an interesting model. And it leads on to the issue of proxy warfare. Is proxy warfare, possibly in the context of a hybrid war, a grey zone conflict, or sub-threshold warfare, is this something for the future? I think it emphatically is. And Many of the success factors are found in Iran's proxy warfare in the Middle East and also in Afghanistan as well. How do you counter this? Well, set a wolf to catch a wolf. It's inherently interagency. There'll be a role of the military. There'll be a role of intelligence agencies. There may also be roles of other government departments, but it is doable. And I think within countries that see themselves as having an international military role and are prepared for their forces to go in harm's way, being able to wage proxy warfare and being able to counter proxy warfare is doable. And it's not just a special forces task. It's a task for all the tools in the military toolbox.
Brigadier, in your book, you suggest that the U.S. failed in its long-term aim of creating an Iraq that was peaceful, united, stable, and secure, well integrated into the international community, and a full partner in the global war on terrorism. Today, we have an unstable Iraq exhibiting a simmering conflict between Sunni and Shia, economically broken and experiencing a possible renewal of ISIS elements. As well, Iran has not only garnered further influence, but is seen as a growing menace within the Middle East. What is your prognosis for this strategic region, and can we curtail Iran's menacing influence?
I think you're right. What was Iran's strategic aims in the Iraq war? I think its first aim was to deter the US from doing regime change in Tehran, and it was able to do this. It also wanted to drive up the cost of occupation for the US, and it wanted a government in Iraq that was never going to attack Iran again. It also managed to further its economic interests. Quite a lot of businesses based on pilgrimages at the Shia holy sites in Iraq are now Iranian owned. But Iran doesn't want Iraq to become a completely failed state. That would be an undesirable outcome from it, because it would allow ISIS and other Sunni militants to gain a serious toehold again. It's like Afghanistan. Iran definitely has had for the last decade or so an influence in Afghanistan, both positive and negative. And there's little doubt that the Taliban's Mossad Shura has also been assisted by Quds Force. But again, Iran can't afford Afghanistan to become completely unstable. It wants an Afghanistan that suits its political, security, and business interests, but it doesn't want to destabilize it. Handling this problem posed by Iran, its networks of malign interests, is a really difficult challenge for the Gulf states, for Saudi Arabia, for Iraq itself, and for the US and its allies. And I think it requires a combination of carrots and sticks, but it's very important it's not characterized by wishful thinking. If the people in charge of this were to ask for my advice, I'd say, make sure you've got a coherent strategy, make sure it's inherently interagency, and do the best you can to expose Iran's malign interference. It's a really tricky challenge, one of the greatest strategic challenge that the US and its allies in the Gulf states face.
Thank you. Brigadier, drawing upon your experience and your research on these 21st century invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, how do you think history will view these Western interventions?
Well, I think they both have to be categorized as failures at this moment. That's overall, that's at the state we find ourselves now. But we should recognize that the initial intervention in Afghanistan was a great success, and that despite all this, Afghanistan has made considerable progress in economic development, in human development, in the role of women. And it's a great pity that this is so much under threat from a resurgent Afghanistan. You yourself described the weaknesses of the Iraqi state. And I have to come to the conclusion that the single dumbest move of all the dumb moves that were displayed was the decision to invade Iraq. And I think it had a similar effort on the war in Afghanistan as Napoleon's attack on Russia did, with his, it disrupted his ability to wage his other campaigns and imposed a great opportunity cost, as indeed did Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union in 1941. And I think, the judgment to attack Iraq must be weighted similarly in military history.
In your book, you did not mention anything about the regimental systems that pervade the armies that were there. Was the system a positive or a negative factor for the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australian forces?
I'd also observe that in my contacts with the US Marine Corps, I've seen aspects of a regimental system there in terms of the linkage to the heritage, particularly of the various Marine regiments and their battles. The US Army doesn't have a regimental system per se, but you do see aspects of the regimental system in the way the cavalry have retained their identity, the cavalry regiments have retained their identity. I think the British Army would say that their regimental system worked during the Iraq and Afghan wars. And in fact, both their infantry reorganized quite extensively, merging a lot of smaller regiments into larger ones. The regiment I belonged to, the light infantry, merged with other regiments to call the rifles. And on merger day, 3 of the forming battalions were all with the 19th Brigade in Basra, and they celebrated the merger by the brigade commander taking out a patrol of members of all these founding regiments. Everything I've learned about the Canadian role, including the hard fighting of Operation Medusa, suggests to me that the Canadian regimental system performed extremely well, and the same about the Australian system. Although all regimental systems have their weakness and overconfidence and complacency, and sometimes they can have negative effects, which I think is one of the aspects of the disturbing story about the Australian Special Forces committing war crimes.
One in our audience was struck by your Clausewitz comment, read the character of war. Did the United Kingdom in the early years of Iraq rely too much on experience versus the PIRA failing to understand the insurgency facing them?
Well, I think they were guilty of over-optimism. What was the case is that by sort of 2004, 2005, many people serving in the middle management of the army had experience in Northern Ireland, but the experience was of Northern Ireland as quite a benign operational environment where the role of the military was quite focused on counterterrorism and public order. It was the early 1970s when the military was in the lead in a counterinsurgency campaign. In fact, many senior officers who served in stabilization operations in Iraq in 2003, 2004 consciously sought to apply peace support operation doctrine rather than counterinsurgency doctrine. I think there was also considerable short-termism because everybody in the British contingent in Iraq at that period of time was on six-month tours, and there was an urge to be seen to be making progress during 6-month tours. But one observation I'd make, and I think this applies to the United States as well, is we mustn't forget that in 2004, 2005, there was a series of national elections and national referendums in Iraq. And there were great television images of Iraqis queuing to vote, of lots of women voting, of lots of people waving their fingers in the air, which they dipped in purple ink, and a successful security operation for all those 3 exercises where the Iraqi security forces weren't found wanting. Well, of course, in retrospect, we know that the Shia-dominated security forces had a vested interest in it working, so the Shias could seize political control. And I think all of this reinforced overconfidence and short-termism.
In your book, you basically suggest there's a varying concept of victory that evolved throughout OEF and ISAF. How can we define it successfully prior to encountering future inevitable crises?
Well, I think it's fair to say that if you look at US, UK, and NATO strategic objectives for Iraq and Afghanistan, as the wars went on, the objectives became less ambitious. And certainly by 2009, 2010, British officers and officials involved in Afghanistan were talking about Afghan good enough. I think there's no substitute for proper strategic planning, including mission analysis and testing whether the objectives are achievable, and actually adjusting objectives, which can include making them less demanding and dumbing them down, is exactly what strategic leadership should be capable of doing if the situation changes. What I did in the book was to compare the conditions that were applying in Iraq in both 2011, 2014, and now, with the objectives proclaimed in the 2005 US National Strategy for Victory in Iraq, which was very ambitious. I think there's one other point as well, is that strategic leaders and things like strategic military headquarters or national security councils, they should quite rightly be getting their information fed from the bottom up. But there's a lot of value in directed telescopes. And a directed telescope can be a prime ministerial or a presidential special representative. It can also be like the Council of Colonels that was assembled in the Pentagon in 2006. And one thing that's really important is that senior visitors, politicians, chief of defense, army commanders, commanders of joint headquarters, when they go to theatre for their visit, they must have a way in getting a feel for the ground truth. I mean, for example, there's a period in Basra in 2007, early 2008, where the self-imposed constraints the British were under meant that morale was very, very low. A lot of people who were there at the time have told me so. You won't find any hint of that in any of the official reports at the time. So, strategic decision makers, they do need directed telescopes, most definitely.
Another question came in, and it's more political in nature. Despite the UK's heavy military and economic commitment to these wars, it seems that the UK influence was limited in Washington. If so, what for the UK and Canadian governments?
Yes, it was. And actually, this is extremely well covered in the Iraq inquiry, which produces a wealth of evidence to show that the US had much less influence the UK had much less influence on US decision making than it liked to think it had. Now, some of that may be because it didn't press the US. It wasn't willing to have uncomfortable conversations. Though, of course, Donald Rumsfeld was willing to have an uncomfortable conversation with anyone who got in his way. It was also that after the initial invasion, where I think the UK did take a fair share of the burden, it drew down much more quickly than the US, and its forces were much less mobilized than the US military was, and it was rather content to stay that way. It was also a case in Iraq that after the invasion, British strategy diverged from the US and was increasingly diverging. And I think sometimes the British military sensed their weakness and again were reluctant to press the US. But there's no doubt in my mind that military credibility and combat power does buy influence with the US. But I think all of those who are junior partners to the US, they want to try and make sure that the conversations behind closed doors are frank in both directions. The US Army hasn't produced an excellent in-house history of its war in Iraq. And it's really quite interesting to see what they make of the British strengths and weaknesses. But there's no substitute, like in difficulties within families, of being able to have that difficult conversation, but while keeping your tempers.
This is more on the issues relating to training and education. The question is, reflecting on these two conflicts, how do we, the armies, train for the future?
Well, I think in terms of the tactical combat capabilities, there's no substitute for training against a credible and complicated enemy and in demanding environments. And I particularly worry that so many Western armies are still, their default setting is rural operations, and they ought to be spending at least half their time in the urban environment. I think I've covered the need for increasingly broad training and education for more senior military leaders. I think the other thing that armed forces should accept is that there is no silver bullet. The silver bullet is combined arms, it's joint, and it's interagency. The British have a word for this, which is now multi-domain integration. And it's cooperating with the people who you can identify you're going to need to cooperate in all those organizations in peace. But it's also having the ability to plug into other organizations who you may not have anticipated. And what it means is you need commanders that can do direct physical combat leadership, but you also need them to be able to adopt an open style and embrace all sorts of other actors and create a coalition. And I've seen that done myself, an informal coalition of international agencies created around the International High Representative in Bosnia in 2003. And I must say, my Canadian staff and the 2nd PPCLI battle group that I had the privilege to have working for me seriously got it and knew how to do it. But you've got to keep the thing alive through practice. Brigadier,
we've now basically consumed an hour of your time. And again, I would like to thank you on behalf of all the audience for your time to give us an overview of this magnificent book, which I firmly believe should be read at staff colleges. At this moment, I shall pass the floor to our chairman, Goran Pesic. Thank you again, Brigadier.
On behalf of Policy Insights Forum and Samuel Associates, I would like to thank our special guest, Ben Barry, and the event moderator, Dr. Paul Taillon, for an outstanding presentation today. Our audience, thank you for participating in our Strategic Perspective series. For more information about our upcoming events, please visit us at www.policyinsights.ca, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.